Natural Habitat Adventures is pleased to be bringing you this webinar today, Experience Summer in Yellowstone. It's presented today by Kevin Taylor, who is broadcasting live for us today from Wyoming. Before I turn it over to Kevin, I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about him. Kevin has a bachelor's degree in biology from Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, and gained a master's degree in botany from the University of Wyoming in Laramie. Kevin's experiences have ranged from working as a contract biologist with the Montana Fish, Wildlife, Parks and Park Service in Helena, Montana, to teaching summer courses with the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Colorado. Kevin later became a part of the faculty at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, and he has a true passion for the wolves of the Yellowstone region, and for years and on our trips conveys that passion to each and every traveler. So really feel fortunate to have Kevin with us today to tell us more about what it's like to experience summer in Yellowstone. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Lee, and welcome everyone. It's great to be with you this afternoon. Before I get started with the presentation, I do have some photographers that I'm very thankful that they're so generous with some of their photography. So some of the photographs some of the photographers that I'd like to thank are Jared Becker, Paul Brown, Sean Beckett, Henry Holdsworth, Colin McNulty, Jim Halfpenny, Scott Larson, Rick McIntyre, Eric Rock, and then the National Park Service. So thank you to all of them for providing some of the photography for this presentation. Okay, so here's a picture of me. This is me. So you don't have to be on the other on your computer wondering what I look like. This is me. and Lee, again, thank you for the bio. A few things I'd like to add is that I grew up in Illinois. Midwesterner, which is why I'm such a nice guy, but I've lived now the second half of my life in Colorado and Wyoming in the Rocky Mountains. So I oftentimes think of Illinois as being my family home, and Colorado and Wyoming and the Rockies as being my heart home. I've pretty much spent the 1990s doing ecological research, and then the 2000s teaching and guiding. Hopefully you'll realize by the end of this presentation that I'm very passionate about this place. It's a very, very special place to me that I call home. That is the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I've lived in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is in the southern half of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which I'll define shortly. And I've lived here for 13 years. And I've had the great fortune and the honor of being able to have actually led the first Natural Habitat Adventures trip in Yellowstone 13 years ago, so I'm fortunate for that. So over the course of this presentation, I'll actually be presenting for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be opportunity for questions, as Lee said. And I plan to talk about the ecology, geology, and the human history of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And then throughout my presentation, I'll be including some of the details of exploring this place with Natural Habitat Adventures. Okay, so I mentioned that expression, Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. What am I talking about? I'm talking about this green area here, kind of this strange shaped green area. Notice how non-squared off it is. The reason why it looks so oblong is it follows the contours of the mountains of the land, because whenever you're talking about an ecosystem, it's not a political boundary as a state boundary would be. It's actually a boundary, or it's defined based upon how the animals use this land. So of course, migrating elk that migrate from Yellowstone down to Jackson Hole, they're not paying attention to the political boundaries of states, okay? And within the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we've got Yellowstone, which is this square right here. It's about 2.2 million acres. South of Yellowstone, we have Grand Teton National Park, which is about 310,000 acres, and then we have all the surrounding lands. This whole ecosystem, this whole green portion here, is about 18 million acres. It's one of the largest intact ecosystems in the temperate region around the world. It's a very impressive place. And I know there's a lot going on here, but again, this is the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and this dotted red line surrounds the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Within this area, much of it is protected land. So there's two national parks, Yellowstone and Grand Teton. There's 3 national wildlife refuges, 7 national forests, different national forests. There's BLM land, which is Bureau of Land Management, federal lands, state lands, and then of course private lands. And I think one of the things that is particularly impressive about this area is that all of the animal species that were here prior to settlement are still here. This area is actually bigger than the states of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts put together. Here's a little a diagram of where Serengeti National Park is located in right on the border of Tanzania and Kenya in eastern Africa. Just to kind of give you a sense for the size of this area, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is actually 5 times bigger than Serengeti National Park. So with our summer expeditions with Natural Habitat Adventures, we start our expeditions in the town of Jackson, right here. And so oftentimes, that expression Jackson and Jackson Hole are used interchangeably. But if you were to do a Google search, you'd actually find that you'd get a much more extensive amount of information from Jackson Hole versus Jackson. And the reason why is Jackson, right here, is the town of Jackson, and then this whole flat area surrounded by mountains is Jackson Hole. The French fur trappers, who were the first non-Native Americans to this area, they would typically call big valleys like this surrounded by mountains, they would call it a hole, like a honey hole for trapping beaver, and then they'd name the hole after a prominent figure of the time. So in this case, Davy Jackson was an early fur trapper and trader back in the 1820s and 1830s. The Tetons are on the west side of Jackson Hole, and then the Gros Ventre Range mountains are on the east side, and then Yellowstone to the north. Feel free in the background there to say ooh and ah, even though I can't hear you. Feel free to do that. These are the Tetons. As you know, they're impressive mountains. If you've ever spent any time in the Alps, you might say, wow, those look a lot like the Alps. And interestingly, they're of similar age and similar geological makeup. The Tetons are some of the youngest mountains in North America. According to geologists, they're a mere 10 million years old, which sounds old, 10 million years, but geologically it's not a very long time. But interestingly, these are some of the youngest mountains in North America, but yet the rock on top of the Tetons is an old, a very, very old rock that's metamorphic and that's granitic, and it's 2.4 to 2.8 billion years old. So these mountains are some of the youngest mountains in North America, but yet the rock on top that has been pushed up from down deep in the earth is actually some of the oldest rock in North America. So this is Mount Moran, which is in the northern Tetons. And in the foreground, we have a side channel of the Snake River. The Snake River actually cuts right through the middle of Jackson Hole and drains all this valley. So whenever any snow melts in the Tetons, it ends up into the Snake River and eventually into the Pacific Ocean. But this is a side channel of the Snake River. And when we look for wildlife on our Natural Habitat Adventures trips, we spend a lot of time along rivers. And here's a statistic that will kind of help you understand that. So when you look at the state of Wyoming, 1 to 2% of Wyoming is riparian habitat. That is river habitat, 1 to 2%. However, 80% of Wyoming's wildlife depend on this riparian habitat during some time during the year. So when I say wildlife, I'm not just talking about mammals. I'm talking about insects. I'm talking about birds and other animals without backbones, other invertebrates. So 80% of Wyoming's wildlife depend on these river corridors for food, for water, for shade, for migratory corridors, for nesting spots, for denning spots. So it's incredibly important areas, and so we end up spending a lot of time along these. Well, speaking of big mammals and charismatic megafauna, that's a good expression, charismatic megafauna. I can't help but start with talking about the bison. Bison have made quite a comeback, of course, in the last 100 years, and Yellowstone, we have Yellowstone National Park and the surrounding area to thank for sort of repopulating the bison in much of North America. it's one of those animals that oftentimes we see on our trips quite close. We're in quite close proximity. And the reason why these animals that we're looking at on the screen, these bison, they're just as wild as any animal in the parks, just as wild as a grizzly bear or a mountain lion. However, they oftentimes are just more tolerant of people than a lot of other animals. So we get pretty close looks at them. But some people actually misinterpret that close proximity as, well, they must be tame cattle-like creatures. But the fact of the matter is, if someone breaches that buffer zone, if you will, that distance, that personal space of bison, they will let you know it. And there's actually more deaths and injuries involving bison and people than any other animal in the park. And it's just because people misinterpret their behavior. Well, I wanted to show you this close-up. You can see some frost on the face of this bison. And the reason I wanted to indicate that is that even in the summertime, we can have chilly days that are sometimes below freezing. And so, of course, dressing in layers is key. And our adventure specialists are really great about providing really detailed packing lists in pre-departure information for that kind of information. Another favorite thing for me about spring and summer is the young animals. One of the first of the big mammals to give birth is the bison. They give birth in April or May, and they give birth to these beautiful kind of orangish calves. It almost looks like, the calf almost looks like a cattle calf, doesn't it, almost? But obviously soon it grows up and it develops that hump and starts looking like a bison. But it's a peculiar thing. I'm always, as an ecologist, as a naturalist, I'm always asking the question, well, why do they look like that? Why do they do what they do? And I had a gentleman, a participant on a Natural Habitat Adventures trip a few years ago that was red-green colorblind. And he said that calf, that red calf, blended in perfectly into that green sagebrush shrubbery on the left-hand side. It looked like just different shades of gray, and it blended in perfectly. So to our eyes, those of us who can see colors, that calf sticks out like a sore thumb. However, to a predator like a wolf and other predators that are red-green colorblind, that calf blends in quite well. Potentially on our trips, we can see grizzly bears. May and June are particularly good times for looking for grizzly bears, and really any time during the summer there's a potential. And sometimes we get lucky and we see cubs. This is a mama grizzly bear with 3 yearling cubs. I've got a little riddle for you. So grizzly bears, their breeding season is in June, and they have a 2-month gestation period, okay? 2 months for their young to develop inside them before they give birth, and then they give birth in January. Now, hold on a second. Now let's see. Breeding season in June, a 2-month gestation period, and then they give birth in January. Anyone know? Bears have something called delayed implantation, where they can actually, their egg or eggs can be fertilized in their uterus, but then they divide a couple of times, and then they float around in their uterus until they go into hibernation. Once they're in hibernation, then the female bear can decide whether or not she's in good enough shape to let those fertilized eggs implant in her uterus. And then she'll begin the gestation period of the 2 months, and she'll give birth in the den in January. So that's kind of a fun one. And it's really important that bears give birth in the den, because they give birth, a 350-pound grizzly bear gives birth to a 13-ounce naked, blind, baby grizzly that can't basically do anything other than squirming up to begin feeding. Rocky Mountain elk. There's more, when you're talking about Caris megafauna, big mammals, there's more elk here than any other animals. They are definitely an iconic animal in this area. If you look at those antlers, notice how they're kind of rounded on the top. So antlers, part of the definition of an antler is it falls off every year, okay, and then regrows, which is kind of amazing to think that a bull elk like that grows back those antlers every year. It's almost like if our legs dropped off every year and we had to regrow legs each year. The amount of energy that takes is just phenomenal. So typically the elk around these parts drop their antlers in typically in March, sometimes into April. Some of the younger bulls will drop theirs off in April, and then we'll start regrowing them soon after at the end of April. And these antlers that we're seeing on this bull elk actually only take 4 to 4.5 months to grow. Pretty incredible. And when you think about it, one of the challenges of growing bone outside of the body is how do you get blood flow to them? So many of you have heard that expression, a bull in velvet or a buck in velvet. What that is as those antlers are growing, they have a thin skin on the outside of those antlers, and that thin skin is full of capillaries, blood vessels, to feed that developing bone. And then because, as I mentioned, we do have chilly days, chilly nights all summer long, it's really helpful for these elk to have a thin fur, a velvet, if you will, on the outside of those antlers in order to insulate that thin skin. So that's where that expression buck or bull in velvet comes in. And I don't know if we have any Lord of the Rings fans out there or any Harry Potter fans out there, but if you had your Lord of the Rings Frodo's ring on or your Harry Potter invisibility cloak, and if you were to walk up on this bull, which of course you wouldn't really, but if you did, and you felt the tip of that antler, it would feel like moving your nose. It would feel like cartilage. And the antlers, as they're growing, as they're developing, they harden from the base up, but those tips are always in, the tip inch or inch and a half of those antlers is always soft like cartilage. And then eventually at the end of August, the antlers come to a point, they completely harden, and then they no longer need that blood flow, and that thin skin begins to then dry up and fall off. This slide is to remind me that we do, in fact, have a lot of fun on these trips. The right side of that spotting scope is the side that one should be looking through. Moose. Now, moose are an animal that a lot of people who come to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem really enjoy seeing. They're the biggest member of the deer family, and they look a little bit like deer and elk, but they look a little bit different, don't they? If I had to point to one animal that was most adaptive to living in this climate, and when I say this climate, it's a very cold place. It's a place that has deep snow from October through April and sometimes beyond, especially up in the mountaintops. So this animal is incredibly well adapted to living in this climate. Some of those adaptations are that dark coat. That dark coat absorbs a lot of solar radiation in the wintertime. Sometimes on a 25-degree day, 25 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes the moose has to get up and get into the shade because he's too warm out in the sun on a 25-degree day. Also, moose, the reason why they walk kind of funny, you know, if you remember that show Northern Exposure, you remember the moose walking through town in the beginning of the show, it looked like a 12-year-old who's kind of growing into their body. The reason for that, they're quite coordinated actually, but they have special joints in their shoulders and in their hips that allow them to pick up their legs much higher than other animals. And what that does then, it allows them to take a step into the snow and then pick up their leg quite high before they take their next step. That way they're not dragging their legs through the deep snow, which takes a lot of energy. Here's a female with calves. You can see the calves are a little bit blurry, very much on the move. Oftentimes moose have twin calves. That's not unusual. And twins versus single, that's oftentimes an indicator what kind of shape she's in. So if a female moose is in really good shape, she'll have and raise twins. The bull moose. You know, another adaptation that moose have to living here is, look at that dewlap. See that beard right underneath the chin? It's called a dewlap, sometimes called a bell. And it makes sense with bull moose that the bigger the dewlap, the bigger the antlers, the bigger the moose. And it's kind of part of show, because really antlers are about 90% show. It's a big billboard saying, hey, look at me, I've got great genetics, breed with me, and you'll have calves that are also strong like me. Well, this dewlap tends to be bigger on bigger males. But as you saw from the previous slide, females have a little dewlap as well. So what is this for? Well, if a moose puts its head down in the water to get aquatic vegetation, aquatic plants, which they oftentimes do, if a moose didn't have that dewlap, they'd pick up their head, and all that water would go down their chin, down their neck, all over their chest, and get them all wet. And that can be pretty cold water, especially in the wintertime. So what that dewlap does is the water comes out of their mouth, runs to their chin, hits the dewlap, and drops off without the water streaming down their chest and legs. So it's kind of like a bib, really, helping them to keep their coat drier and therefore warmer. So these are the vehicles, these Mercedes Sprinters, these are the vehicles that we use on our programs. They are customized, and one of the most significant customization that we have on these vehicles is we have these roof hatches. You can see these two people looking through binoculars out the roof hatch. So sometimes if we're really close, let's say we pull up on a dirt road and we're really close to a moose or we're really close to bison, and we don't want to get out of the vehicle so as not to put ourselves in danger and not to scare the animal, what we can do is we can pull over at a safe pullout, stop the vehicle, and we can pop open those roof hatches. People can stand up on the seats and look out. These animals know we're human, but oftentimes the vehicle can serve as a bit of a blind. It's much less stressful for them if they're close to be all clustered together in the vehicle versus separate individuals out of the vehicle. And that's a really important ethic for natural habitat adventures, is that we never want to watch these animals at the risk of stressing them out. So ethical wildlife viewing is really important. So for all of our programs, we do provide high quality binoculars, and then we also have spotting scopes, and you can see this spotting scope set up on this tripod right here. That's really handy for being able to watch some of those animals that we don't necessarily get as close to. It allows us to watch these animals and really get a great look at them because we're looking through a 30 to 60 power spotting scope. So it's kind of moving out of Jackson Hole, and when I say Jackson Hole, sometimes I actually sort of use that in equivalence with Grand Teton National Park, because most of Jackson Hole is Grand Teton National Park. And in these programs, in our Yellowstone programs, even though we call it a Yellowstone program, we're also spending time and becoming intimate, much more intimate, with Grand Teton National Park as well. And so kind of moving into Yellowstone National Park, this is the Roosevelt Arch, which is located at the northern entrance of the park. And Yellowstone became a park in 1872. 1872, now in the scheme of human history, not a very long time ago. However, this area was very different back then in 1872. Just to give you a sense for how different Yellowstone was and this area was, in 1877, 5 years after Yellowstone became a park, Chief Joseph, the famous chief of the Nez Perce, or the Nez Perce Indians, Native Americans, he and his 500 people and 1,000 horses were chased across Yellowstone by the U.S. Cavalry 5 years after this became a national park. So the so-called Indian Wars were going on after this became a national park. So that just gives you a sense for how different things were back then. And just a little bit of presidential, U.S. president history. It was Ulysses S. Grant who was the president in 1872. This arch, the cornerstone was not laid until 1903, and that was laid down by Teddy Roosevelt, who wasn't necessarily instrumental in protecting Yellowstone, but he was actually instrumental in setting aside a lot of the national forests surrounding Yellowstone National Park. And I should mention, talking about Yellowstone, I should mention that Yellowstone is the world's first national park. Not just the U.S. first national park, but the world's first national park. And every time I say that, not only do I get goosebumps, but I also say it with a great deal of pride. And I talked earlier that Yellowstone is 2.2 million acres. I so oftentimes, and many of our participants think of, oh yeah, Yellowstone, it was set aside for wildlife, 2.2 million acres of wildlife habitat, right? Well, it turns out that back in 1872, it wasn't necessarily set aside for wildlife habitat. Now, by default, it became that way. However, Yellowstone Park was set aside for its geothermal features. Now be prepared. You might have to, get comfortable in your seat so as not to fall off your seat here, because based upon this statistic, 3/4 of the world's geothermal features are located in Yellowstone. Said another way, 75% of the world's geothermal features are located in Yellowstone. Feel free to ooh and ah in the background. This is called Grand Prismatic Hot Spring. It's the third largest hot spring in the world, behind two that are located in New Zealand. And this is the largest hot spring in Yellowstone National Park. It's 250 feet wide and 350 feet long. And all those colors that you see around the outside are called thermophilic bacteria. Thermophilic meaning heat-loving. So when the water changes course for some reason, the thermophilic colors that you see, the thermophilic bacterial colors that you see, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, those would quickly die were it not for that hot water, because literally out of this cauldron, out of this hot spring is coming water that's 200 degrees Fahrenheit plus. So Old Faithful, many of you might recognize Old Faithful. Old Faithful is you know, obviously you can't come to Yellowstone without seeing Old Faithful. Old Faithful goes off every 90 minutes plus or minus 10 minutes, which is pretty incredible when you think that that water we see there is water that was rainwater or snowmelt that was perhaps fell from the sky, went down through the ground, heated up by hot rock underneath the ground, and then came back to the surface. Pressure built up, was released in this geyser, and all that process that I just told you happens over the course of about 50 years. So the fact that Old Faithful goes off every 90 minutes plus or minus 10 is pretty phenomenal. And by the way, what's this heat source? Well, you've probably heard of the Yellowstone caldera. About 5 miles underneath Yellowstone is this basically underground volcano. It's called a magma chamber, and it's where molten lava from the mantle of the earth is coming surprisingly close to the surface of the earth. 5 miles is pretty close, especially when you consider that typically around the world the mantle of the earth is 60 to 90 miles deep. Under Yellowstone it's 5 miles deep, and that's the source of heat for all this hot water coming out of the ground. Here's another geyser called Castle Geyser, and it goes off every 9 to 11 hours. So it kind of puts in perspective that Yellowstone, or excuse me, Old Faithful goes off 90 minutes plus or minus 10. Castle Geyser goes off every 9 to 11 hours. It throws up a plume of volcanic, well, not volcanic, but water eruption that goes up 60 to 90 feet and blasts for about 20 minutes. And then after the eruption, it has a steam phase that lasts between 30 and 40 minutes. This is another geothermal area that's quite different from many areas in Yellowstone, and it's called the Mammoth Hot Springs area. Most of the rock underneath Mammoth Hot Springs area in the northern portions of Yellowstone is a rock called limestone. And that hot water that's underneath the ground, that hot water dissolves that limestone, brings it to the surface, and then it chemically changes and becomes calcium carbonate and is laid down and deposited on the ground, giving it that chalky white appearance. And then the different browns and oranges that you see on the rock are those thermophilic bacteria growing on the rock. You know, as you think about these slides, as you think about these geothermal features, imagine being the first people to come into what's now Yellowstone and seeing these areas. Today, I consider this place a powerful place. You can imagine the first people who came here, what they must have thought and what they must have felt. This is another view of the Mammoth terraces, and Mammoth is the park headquarters area of Yellowstone National Park. It's the lowest elevation, the driest area, and you can see some of the historical buildings in the Mammoth headquarters area. This is one of the more impressive waterfalls in Yellowstone. There's several waterfalls in Yellowstone. This is one of the most impressive ones. It's called the Lower Falls of the Yellowstone River. So the Yellowstone River is one of the, well, it's thought to be the longest undammed river in the U.S. It's over 600 miles, and it originates just outside of Yellowstone, out the southeast corner of Yellowstone. And this falls drops about 308 feet. And below the falls, this river has carved out this very impressive canyon called the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River, and it cuts, depending on where you are in the canyon, it cuts between 800 and 1,200 feet deep, a quarter to 3/4 mile wide, and the canyon is about 24 miles long. Now, even though we're talking about summer in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park, I can't help but show you this slide. So after participants go home from our trips, or before they go home, I like to let them know that when they show slideshows of all the incredible experiences that they had here in Yellowstone and Grand Teton, if somebody asks them an ecological question, I always say that they can at least be partially right if they answer the ecological question as follows. Are you ready with your pens and pencils? Long, cold winters with deep snow and short, cool, dry summers. That right there, long, cold winters with deep snow, short, cool, dry summers, that can at least partially answer most ecological questions around these parts. Winters are very, very long. I've seen snow at Old Faithful in July. And snow can be on the ground in the valleys very easily October through April and sometimes beyond, and then of course in the mountains for most of the year. And Natural Habitat Adventures offers trips certainly May through September, but also offers winter trips January through February. So fire and fire ecology is a very important part of Yellowstone. Many of you might have been to Yellowstone since the 1988 fires. And these trees here that you see are what are called lodgepole pine trees. 80% of the forest cover in Yellowstone and Grand Teton are lodgepole pine trees. It's a tree that's just really well adapted to living here. But one of the pieces of evidence that suggests to us that fire is a very normal part of the ecology in these parts is that lodgepole pine have two different kinds of pine cones. They have a pine cone that is like a normal pine cone that you think of, but then they have a second cone that is sealed shut with resins that only opens up when a fire comes through. So the fire comes through, burns the trees, but it protects the serotinous cones that are sealed. It protects those seeds on the inside. Once the fires have moved through, the cones open up slowly, drop the seeds, and revegetate Yellowstone. And we see a lot of that sign of those young trees back from 1988. I think it's appropriate that this animal be showed in a blur. The fastest land animal in the world is the cheetah. They can run 65 to 70 miles per hour. The pronghorn, sometimes called pronghorn antelope, but the pronghorn can actually run 60 miles per hour. I showed a grizzly bear earlier. We also have black bears, and this is a black bear feeding on hawthorn berries in August. Our berry season, when you think about our berry season, that's typically the month of August. So when I talked earlier about this being an intact ecosystem and all of the species of animals that were here prior to settlement being still here, this is a wonderful animal that has helped, the reintroduction of this animal, the wolf, has helped complete what I just said. So the reintroduction of wolves has been very, very successful. The reintroduction happened amazingly, it's hard to believe, but it happened 20 years ago, or started 20 years ago in January 1995. So we actually had the 20th anniversary this year. And you'd think back in 1995 and 1996 that we would have, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would have gone to Minnesota, trap wolves there, and bring them down to Yellowstone. That seems like it would be less expensive and involve a lot less red tape. But instead, the federal government, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, actually went up to Canada to trap those wolves in British Columbia and Alberta. And you think, well, why do that? Well, here's the deal. Wolves in Minnesota are mostly eating white-tailed deer, which is what's available to them. We don't have very many white-tailed deer here. We have very, very few. What we have a lot of is elk and bison. And so it made sense for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to actually trap wolves up in places up in Canada where wolves were familiar with hunting elk and bison. Wolves can not only be gray, but they can be black as well. Look how lean this wolf looks. You can tell it's in its winter coat because just like your dogs and cats are shedding their winter coats right now and developing their summer coats, so are wolves and other animals. This is a particularly exciting time of year. Well, I guess there's exciting times any time of year, but right now the wolves are starting to have their pups right now as we speak. And they start coming out of the dens and potentially start becoming visible in May and June. So that's a fun thing to look for any place in the ecosystem, but particularly the northern 10 to 15% of Yellowstone Park. Beavers. Anybody know why beavers build dams? I'm a very proud father. In fact, I'm surprised I've been with you this long and not told you that I'm a father. All of the books that I've read about beavers talk about beavers building dams, but very few of them talk about why they do. The reason why beavers build dams is to basically flood an area and flood their food source so that they don't have to get out of the water to feed. Because when a beaver gets out of the water, they're like a fish out of the water. But basically by building a dam, making a pond, and then building a lodge right in the middle of the pond, that basically keeps them safer. So they do it for selfish reasons, but as a result, they end up really creating some wonderful wildlife habitat. I can't help but show a rodent picture here. This is a coyote pup in the upper right-hand corner, but these are Uinta ground squirrels. They're about the size of, somewhere between a gerbil and a guinea pig. And they're very common around here, and anything with teeth eats ground squirrels. And amazingly, they just came out of hibernation in the last couple of weeks. They hibernate from late July, early August, all the way into April. I, of course, have to show an insect slide. So oftentimes when we think of biodiversity, we think of big mammals, right? Well, we have 60 mammals in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Park. However, we have thousands of insects. This is a longhorn beetle. And of course, we have lots of bird species as well. For those bird lovers out there, we have as many as 300 different bird species that use the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. 300 in the summer potentially could be here, but only about 50 of them potentially spend the winter around here due to having to leave the ecosystem to migrate out to a milder place. This is a great gray owl. It's the longest owl from tail to forehead. It's the longest owl in North America. Red-shafted flickers, it's a cavity nester that's a fairly large woodpecker species. And mountain bluebirds. Mountain bluebirds are a real sign of spring around here. They arrived here about a month or a month and a half ago, and when they come from Mexico, that's a real sign that spring is here. We have many waterfowl, animals, birds that live in the water, and this is what's called a Barrow's goldeneye. They're a common diving duck. In fact, you can see that golden eye. The camera really picked that up, that golden eye. When they fly overhead, even if you didn't see them, you can hear them because they have a whistle when they're flying. Bald eagles. One of our best chances of seeing bald eagles here is in the summertime. On our Natural Habitat Adventures trip, we typically include rafting down the Snake River in Grand Teton National Park, and that's a great opportunity to see bald eagles nesting. Now, as a botanist with a botanist background, I'd be remiss once again if I didn't include some wildflower shots. This is a plant called elephant's head, and if you look at each one of these flowers, it looks a little bit like an elephant with that trunk coming out with the ears. Maybe you have to squint a little bit. If we have any Texans in the audience, this is a plant closely related to your state flower, the Texas bluebonnet. This is called lupins, and we have meadows that are just full of these in the summertime. A couple other wildflower meadows here. This is Indian paintbrush and Lewis's monkey flower here in the foreground. Well, I have to say, one of the things that I really enjoy about guiding is that trip participants never let me take this place for granted. This is where I live. This is my backyard, if you will. But I get the chance to see this place through new, fresh eyes throughout the year, and you participants don't let me take it for granted, which is wonderful. And truly, there's only one thing better than seeing the greater Yellowstone ecosystem on your own, and that's having shared experiences in this incredible place. On behalf of Natural Habitat Adventures, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thanks for being with me today. I appreciate you taking the time, and I'd be glad to take any questions that you have.
Thanks, Kevin. Great presentation. We've got some good questions here, and before I jump into those, though, I just want to encourage anyone listening to send in questions that you might have for Kevin, and if you need a reminder, you just need to open up the control panel over on the right. You might need to click on the orange button with the white arrow to get to that. So Kevin, we have some good questions here. The first one, this is always popular. It's about the temperature and the weather, specifically May through August. Is it going to be hot? Is it going to be rainy? What can you expect?
Yes, well, so summertime, a lot of people, a lot of the participants, I'm sure, think of summertime as, May through August, but really May is still springtime for us. It's not unusual to have some snow. And then as we get into June, July, and August, those are our warmest months. July is definitely our warmest month. In July, it's not unusual for us to have 40-degree nighttime temperatures and 80 to 85 Fahrenheit daytime temperatures. While May, it's not unusual to have below freezing temperatures during the night times, and then 70s during the day. That's pretty typical. But 40 and 50-degree swings are not unusual at all. So wearing layers is really key. That's always the key. But don't let the chilly temperatures sway you in a negative way, because chilliness is actually a really good thing. Because imagine having a fur coat on like an elk or a moose from almost the tip of your nose to almost the tip of your toes. You would want to have chilly weather too, right? So the chilliness is actually helpful for watching wildlife, and that's why we oftentimes take advantage of the mornings and the evenings to look for those animals that are not very tolerant of the heat of the day.
All righty, thank you. And we have a listener with us today who was last in Yellowstone in 2002. She says long after the 1988 wildfire. However, she noted that the visible effects from the fire were very much more than anticipated, especially compared to the Yellowstone she had visited as a teen in the 70s. And she just wondered how the ecosystem might have recovered since 2002 when she was last there.
I think that she would definitely see that the trees were taller now than they were 13 years ago, but trees grow very slowly around here. In fact, when you're looking at tree rings and counting the tree rings to see how old a tree is, sometimes you need magnification because they grow so slowly. Our growing seasons are very short and they're very cool, and so trees don't grow very fast. So we still see, even now, we see a lot of sign of past fires, particularly the 88 fires. And to the caller, I really encourage you to come back since 2002, because that was when I first moved here, and it's amazing how much has changed from a sort of population dynamics of different wildlife now that we've had 13 more years of wolves being in the Yellowstone area. Moose, for example, in northern Yellowstone, we've been seeing, typically I would say on these trips we'll look for moose down in Jackson Hole, but we're less likely to see them up in Yellowstone. But especially in the last couple of years, we've been seeing a lot more moose in northern Yellowstone, and it's hypothesized, it's predicted that that's probably because the wolves have caused elk to change their behavior and not spend as much time in moose habitat, spreading out more, therefore leaving more food for moose. And the moose have kind of come back into northern Yellowstone, and we don't know for sure if it's because of the wolves, but we certainly predict that they had an influence there. So I think that to the caller, that you would really appreciate coming back and seeing some of those changes.
Super. Thank you very much, Kevin. And this is sort of dovetails onto that, our questions earlier, I guess I should say, about the weather. There was a follow-up question about the the wildflower season, and when you should come if you really want to see Yellowstone in full bloom.
Okay, well, I appreciate that question, and really it always depends on when the snow melts, because there's a lot of plants that once the snow melts, the wildflowers know, they seem to know that they don't have a lot of time to do their thing. So as soon as the snow melts and the ground starts thawing, wildflowers begin to come up. And so it depends a lot on snow melt. And so on early snow melt years like this year, the peak blooms might be a little on the earlier side, whereas a later year like last year, they extend a little bit later into the season. However, one of the great things about being in the mountains and in mountainous areas is you can have summer in the valley and spring in the mountains, because again, remember, these plants coming up really depend on when the snow is melting. So in this slide that I have on, my concluding slide, you can see it's very much summer vegetation. The airleaf balsam root in the foreground, that's a summer wildflower or early summer wildflower, but yet up towards where the snow is, there's a lot of spring still left to happen up there. So if in the later summer, for example, if a lot of the plants have begun to senesce, all you have to do is go up to higher elevations and you you can kind of go back in time, if you will, because those areas at higher elevations have not been out from under snow for very long.
Super, thank you. There's a question here about climate change and how that might have impacted the park. Wondering if you might talk about that for a minute.
Yes. Yes. So how much time do we have? I think we need another, I think we might need another webinar for that one.
Another whole webinar, right?
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of, there's certainly a lot of hypotheses, a lot of predictions for what is happening and what will happen as the climate changes. And just a note about climate change. Some people get really sort of emotional with that term. I don't think the climate change piece is the emotional part, because after all, I mean, all you have to do is watch the evening news to see that we are seeing changes, and we're seeing some more dramatic storms in past, that kind of thing. The real controversial part sometimes in the discussions is who's at fault, is humans at fault. So I just want to clarify that. So when talking about climate change, just what we're observing, some of the examples would be white bark pine, which is a really important tree. The cone, the nuts, are really important to grizzly bears. And as we see more snow, or I should say as we see less snow up at higher elevations, that would mean less snow to support the moisture needs of white bark pine, and some predict that that will lessen the habitat for white bark pine, therefore providing less of a very important food source for grizzly bears and other birds. Another example where climate change has had an effect on the ecosystem is, many of you are familiar with mountain pine bark beetles. Certainly people in the West know them, and it's really become world news. It's become, well, at least national news, the mountain pine bark beetles, and they've really been hard on, they've decimated or at least killed a lot of pine trees across the western United States. Including white bark pine, which is that important food source for the grizzly. And one of the reasons why we're seeing unprecedented outbreaks of mountain pine bark beetles is, and I should mention, the pine bark beetle is native. The mountain pine bark beetle is native, and it's been around probably as long as the pine trees have. However, we have conditions right now that favor an incredible outbreak, and those conditions are milder winters. So the milder winters is such that the pine bark beetles are less likely to freeze over the winter and be killed. So milder winters, fewer die over the wintertime. And then much of the Rocky Mountain West has been in a drought for the last 13 plus years. And so the trees are drought stressed and more susceptible to infestation by pine bark beetles. So combination of mild winters and drought summers, the trees are very susceptible to the mountain pine bark beetles, and it's killed a lot of trees in the western United States, which really has an effect, and that's an example of climate change. So those are just some examples. I think one of the big concerns is snow, and how climate change is going to affect snowpack, because if you look at these mountains and you see the snow in the mountains, that snow is a stored water source. That is a stored water source that provides water for people all over the western United States. And if that melts sooner, as we're seeing earlier snow melts, that means there's less water available to potato farmers in Idaho later in the summer. So those are just some examples. Like I said, this is a discussion that we can spend a lot of time on, but those are just some examples. And inevitably, discussions like climate change always come up on our trips. And then one of the fun things I really enjoy about our Natural Habitat Adventures trips is that it's not me and my fellow guides lecturing, it's us facilitating discussions. And because we have very small groups, I don't know if I mentioned it, but we never have more than 7 people per vehicle, such that everyone has a window seat. So they're very small, intimate groups in which we're really able to delve deep into these wonderful and thoughtful discussions.
Thank you so much, Kevin. This has been a great webinar, and I think that we've covered a lot of territory while we were together today, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up now. So I'm just going to turn it back over to you for any closing comments you might have.
Well, terrifically, and thank you all for your questions and again for your attention. And as hopefully you've realized, I'm very passionate about this place, and it's one of my favorite things to do in the world to take people out and facilitate incredible experiences. As a naturalist, it's not a job; it's a way of life, and again, hopefully that comes through on this webinar, and I know it will if you come see us out here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Thank you so much.
And with that, we really want to wish you a good day, and we'll conclude our webinar. Goodbye now.